Hi there, Mr. Fernandez here, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about the causes and the lead up to the War of 1812, which started in 1812. Two learning targets for this mini lecture. One is you'll be able to describe some of the causes of the War of 1812. And then you won't be able to do this yet, but by the time we're done talking about the War of 1812 here and during class time, you'll be able to debate whether or not the U.S. should have declared war on Great Britain in 1812. So just to give you the big picture, this will get you ready to understand the causes of the War of 1812, to see why it was that it happened, or why it was that some people wanted it to happen, here in the United States, I mean, among the political class. And it'll get you ready to understand some reading you'll do in support of or against the War of 1812, and then a debate that we'll have in class about whether or not we should declare war on Britain, the United States should, in 1812. So that's kind of the big picture. Here are the key concepts. You can pause and have a look at those. Those are the A-push key concepts that are relevant to this topic. One thing to note is that this is kind of part of the discussion we've been having in class about the first two political parties, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party, and all the many ways that they disagreed with each other. So pause the video now and just have a look at this list here so you can remember the basics about the two parties. So moving on, we're talking, as you know, John Adams, pictured here, was the Federalist president from until the election of 1800, from 1797 to 1801 when he stepped down after the election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson, the leader of the Democratic Republican Party, the kind of spiritual father of it, if you will, ran against the Federalist John Adams in the election of 1800. And in this election, Thomas Jefferson won the presidency. As you can see, Thomas Jefferson's support came from some of the places that by now had become consistently bastions of Democratic Republicanism, if you will, support the base, if you will, the geographic base of the party. Whereas John Adams's support came primarily from those New England and coastal regions that tended to be the place where Federalists tended to live. So anyway. As you know, Thomas Jefferson took power in 1801 as a result of this election. And there's one thing to note here that's, I think, of importance. And Thomas Jefferson saw it himself. He called the election of 1800 a revolution. He said it was the revolution of 1800, which was as real a revolution in the principles of our government as that of 76. Basically, what he's saying is two things. One is that there was a shift in power from one party to another party, and he thought that this was a good thing. His party, he believed, stood for the right ideals. But more importantly, there was a peaceful shift in power. That is, it didn't require any bloodshed, didn't require any fighting, any violence. Party shifted from one party to, or power shifted from one party to another party peacefully. And that, he said, made it especially a revolution. I think that's important because, there at this point there was no necessarily any reason to believe that once the two-party system came into existence, it wouldn't lead to violence. It sort of was the way things worked back then. The fact that it didn't in the election suggests that the United States was becoming, well, at least in this one respect, a pretty exceptional country. Anyway, like I said, Thomas Jefferson viewed his administration, his election, as the triumph of the ideals of Democratic Republicans against the Federalist ideals. And he did, along with Congress, which also changed hands from the Federalist Party to the Democratic Republican Party, he did oversee the reversal of many of John Adams and the Federalist Congress's previous policies. For example, they reduced the size of the Army and the Navy. Remember that the Federalist or the Democratic Republicans believed that the national government should be limited in power, and that included the military. Reduced the national debt, paid off some of that debt that had been part of Alexander Hamilton's financial plan and the Federalist financial plan. They abolished the whiskey tax, Congress and Jefferson, which was instituted by Hamilton under George Washington. So some important reversals of Federalist policies, again in a peaceful way, which I think is notable, as Jefferson believed as well. One other thing that happened during Jefferson's first term in office was the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase, was it doubled the size of the United States. You'll see in the next slide how significant of an increase in the territory of the U.S. the Louisiana Purchase represented. It was purchased from France, which was still in the throes of the French Revolution. Still having to fight Great Britain and other European countries that were trying to reverse the French Revolution, trying to contain the French Revolution. These monarchies around Europe that were super anxious about this revolution and what it meant for the power of monarchs and aristocrats. And whatchamacallit? And anyway, so in 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte, as part of this conflict in Europe, took Louisiana back from Spain, which because France, France conquered Spain as part of the Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolutionary Wars in Europe. And anyway, the Jefferson's administration negotiated the sale of Louisiana, or the purchase rather, for $15 million, and it doubled the size of the U.S. Those are things that matter as far as this story is concerned. It also meant the acquisition of the port of New Orleans, which was a pretty significant port, a port that was at the mouth of the Mississippi River. It was the gateway to the Gulf of Mexico, which you could go from there to the Caribbean. So let's look at the map here. All of this here is the Louisiana Territory, the Louisiana Purchase. Notice how it's just about doubled the size of the American of America's territory. And here's the New Orleans, right? This is the Gulf of Mexico. So note how important of a port that was for travel by sea from the eastern seaboard, right, back and forth to New Orleans, and up the Mississippi River to the western part of the United States, but also as a gateway into the Caribbean down here and off into the Atlantic and into Europe over there. So a really important acquisition by the United States. But anyway, we'll stop there. So some, of course, look at this as a major a contradictory move on the part of Jefferson. Remember that Jefferson believed, as the Democratic Republicans did, in small government, small national government, in restricting the powers of the national government to a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the president has the right to purchase land, nor the U.S. Congress. And so Jefferson took a pretty liberal reading of the Constitution in order to justify this purchase. And so if somebody like a Federalist like John Adams called Jefferson a hypocrite, he might have to have agreed that he kind of had that coming. But for the base of the Democratic Republican Party, for all the small farmers who were part of this party, all the Southerners and Westerners who were part of this party, this huge territorial acquisition meant a a lot more available cheap land in the future. And so, in many respects, therefore, Jefferson's acquisition made sense, given how interested he was in the fortunes of small farmers over, say, economic elites in big cities like New York and Boston, etc. This would be eventually a boon for those folks who would be able to afford buying land in the new territory. Of course, this wouldn't be so great for Native Americans, and later in this unit we'll talk about that. But perhaps Jefferson's biggest preoccupation during his administration, both in his first and second term, was and one of the main reasons for the eventual declaration of war against Great Britain in the War of 1812. Was the continued conflict between Great Britain and France, which was now being ruled by the Emperor, so-called Napoleon Bonaparte. France and Britain are going at it still since the 1790s. America, the United States, officially continues to maintain its policy of neutrality, and still both sides attack American ships because both sides don't want to restrict the other side's ability to trade with the United States. So the U.S. is once again caught in the middle, or continues to be caught in the middle between these two great powers in this war in Europe. The British step up their so-called impressment policy. Impressment is when American sailors were basically kidnapped. Sailors on American commercial ships, so ships carrying goods across the ocean, were often captured by the British Navy, and the sailors were kidnapped basically and required to serve in the British Navy. That was a policy known as impressment. It was something that navies did back then. The British believed that when the Americans traded with the French, they were violating their embargo, the British embargo on French trade. So it was therefore justifiable, they said, when the U.S. American sailors were kidnapped and forced to serve on the British Navy as a consequence of their violation of that policy. So this, of course, made many Americans mad. Jefferson, in an effort to stop the British from doing this, signed a bill passed by Congress called the Embargo Act in 1807. And the Embargo Act basically did one major thing. It said that Americans would no longer trade with international powers. American ships, in an extraordinary move, were confined to their harbors. And this was all because it was an attempt to stop Americans from getting kidnapped and for American ships being confiscated by the British and the French. And this wasn't meant to be a long-term policy. It was supposed to be meant to be a short-term policy. The idea was to hurt Britain and France, who would then say, sorry, we'll stop doing all the naughty things we're doing if you continue to trade with us. But, it kind of backfired. The Embargo Act meant huge problems, especially for the economies of the New England states, right, which relied on international trade. I mean, think about Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Without international trade, those cities were all about that international trade. So this was a huge problem for the economy. This cartoon is a famous cartoon. It's seen from the perspective of drawn from the perspective of someone who opposed the Embargo Act. There's a ship near, out at the port. Here is some rum or whiskey, I'm not sure which, in a barrel. And this is an American who wants to trade with a British ship here. You see a British ship. And here is the turtle, the snapping turtle, that is being referred to here as, oh, this cursed, oh, grab me. See how it's spelled embargo backwards? So it's a reference to the embargo, and it's supposed to, sort of be an indictment of the embargo, a criticism of the embargo as a snapping turtle that is biting the butt of Americans who are simply trying to trade peacefully with their with their trading partners abroad. Once again, the Federalists saw this policy as hypocritical. Thomas Jefferson, remember, believed in small government, in the government doing as little as possible, and yet a sweeping bill that suspended all trade was certainly a violation of that idea that the government should do as little as possible. He almost certainly would have to have agreed that this was against his very own ideals. But he saw it as the only way to stop the British and the French from doing things that might lead to Americans getting into a war against either Britain or France, which of course is exactly what happened later on. Because in 1809, Jefferson signs the repeal of the Embargo Act after a lot of people put a lot of pressure on his administration to do so. And in a last-ditch effort before he leaves office, he signs the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809, which called on suspended trade with Britain and France in their colonies. Suspended trade with Britain and France, but opens the American ports to all other traders who were not from Britain and France or their colonies. So it was a limited reversal of the Embargo Act, and now the embargo was basically only being applied to British and French trade. But guess what? The trade with Britain was still one of the most important sources of economic activity for many Americans, especially living in the Northeast. So this continued to be a problem for Americans. Anyway, in 1808, James Madison is elected. He takes office in 1809. James Madison is a Democratic Republican, very strong ally of Thomas Jefferson, very much, declares himself to be to have the same values as Thomas Jefferson: small government, power to the people, power to the states, westward expansion, all those things that Democratic Republicans say that they were all about. And once again, James Madison's main problem, diplomatically especially, is the fact that the British and French continue to do naughty things to Americans abroad who are trying to trade with one or the other. Now, the French under Napoleon, in an effort to try and address the Americans' concerns, agreed to stop interfering with shipping. But then they reversed that position pretty much right away, so nothing gets fixed there. The U.S. continues its anti-British trade embargo after temporarily suspending its anti-French trade embargo, although that it serves no purpose because the French reversed their position and continue to attack American ships. And British impressment continues as well. So nothing really gets better, is my point here, under Madison with respect to what's happening overseas to American shipping as the British and French are at each other's throats. Then there's another thing. So this, of course, is one of the main reasons why Americans start getting really mad at Britain, especially. The ongoing problem of the impressment policy of the British, taking American sailors hostage and forcing them to serve in the British Navy, making it impossible for Americans to trade with France, etc., interfering with American shipping rights, etc., etc. In 1810, there's a congressional election, just like we're having a congressional midterm election this year, right? There's no president on the ballot, but Congress. All of the House of Representatives every seat in the House of Representatives will be up for election, and a third of the Senate. In the congressional election of 1810, a group of people that are starting to be called war hawks, and they're all Democratic Republican congressmen, and they're all from the South and the West, come to power. And these people especially, they're being called war hawks because they favor war with Great Britain. They are starting to talk very openly, vocally about how the United States should declare war with Great Britain. So why Great Britain and not France? Both of them are interfering with American shipping rights, although you might say that the British policy of impressment was worse. Still, why the British? Well, Congressman, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, Congressman Henry Clay from Kentucky, the new Speaker of the House, they have a particular gripe in mind when they are calling for war against Great Britain. And it's not entirely about what's happening in the Atlantic Ocean, what the British Navy is doing to American ships. It's more what's happening up here in the Northwest. This, after all, is where the Warhawks are from. Henry Clay, for example, is from Kentucky. Down here, and a lot of these Warhawks are from inland states that are not anywhere nearly as affected by the naval challenges or maritime challenges as those in New England and the Northeast are. So what's their thing? Well, the British continue to have a very strong presence, of course, in what is today known as Canada, right? And the British also continue to have a military presence in American territory up here as well. One of the things that the British are doing is they're trying to destabilize the United States by reportedly supplying Native Americans with aid, both food, and money, and weapons, so that Native Americans along the western frontier can continue to resist European Americans' efforts to settle in the West, making it hard for the Democratic Republicans like Henry Clay to fulfill the vision of the Democratic Republicans of territorial expansion to the West. And so that is almost certainly the main reason why those people in the West, those congressmen from the West and the South, were interested in another fight with Great Britain. Getting Great Britain to back off would mean the Native Americans would lose their support along the frontier, and European Americans would have basically the opportunity to invade more forcefully the West. The conflict with Native Americans is a real thing during this time period. That hasn't really gone away. One of the main things the U.S. Army does in its first 20 years, and it will continue to do so for decades after this, is fight Native Americans. Same thing with state militias like Ohio. Ohio Governor William Henry Harrison, for example, led an effort to defeat the Shawnee, led by Chief Tecumseh, and have a great and decisive victory in the Battle of Tippecanoe River in 1811. And what happens is they discover at the end of this battle that Native Americans actually did have weapons that came from Canada. So the British had been supplying the Native Americans with weapons. This was all the proof Americans needed that the British presence in Canada was a problem if European Americans wanted the Native Americans to be defeated along the western frontier. So anyway, these Warhawks, so-called, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, were calling on this guy, President James Madison, to ask Congress for a declaration of war against Great Britain. And that is what happens, or what is being debated in June of 1812, a moment of decision for American political leaders. Should the United States declare war on Great Britain? Well, that's what we're going to debate in class after you've done a little bit reading in the next assignment. But for now, just go ahead and answer those questions for this video lecture, and we'll see you in class.